What were the different ways that the Luftwaffe conducted air support during World War II? Now that is an excellent question from channel supporter Stahlfaust, which I will answer today. It really hits at the heart of the operational history of the Luftwaffe, so let's get into it. Welcome to the Luftwaffe at War. Stahlfaust's question is a big one. It really is. And because it's such a big question with so many different ways of approaching it, I'm gonna go with a very grounded explanation, and I'll hopefully stay away from this sort of more academic language that you can get in an article just like this one. I've written this one. I'm quite proud of it, in fact. But yes, let's talk about the differences between that air support that the Luftwaffe provided, both from sort of the doctrinal to the operational to the tactical level. And just as supporters like Stahlfaust, Jose and Andy G, you can ask questions too for me to answer by joining the channel as a supporter for less than the price of a coffee a month. This will support the channel and the Luftwaffe at War series, support my research and provide more content for you to enjoy. There's no better episode than this one to prove the benefits of supporting this channel, because much of what I will tell you here was actually made possible by crowdfunded support for the Panzerkonferenz 2022. Back then I dug deep into the archives and wrote the first detailed paper of how the Luftwaffe force structure changed to make close air support possible. To understand the differences in how the Germans used the Schlachtgeschwader, so formations for close air support, and how they used the Kampfgeschwaders, so bombers, we must first understand the conceptual difference between the two, as seen from the Luftwaffe perspective. I know. I know this sounds like it's unnecessary, because it's obvious, close air support and bombing, so different, right? But it's not. We need to understand what the Germans thought back then and not superimpose what we understand as the difference. Now for the Germans, things change across the years, but to simplify it, I will speak of the pre-1943 period and then of the post-1943 period. The cutoff is basically that 1942-1943 winter, but with some contextual overlap, of course. This will then answer the question why the Germans did not really have close air support aircraft as we think about them until 1942-1943, why this changed, and how this changed things on the battlefield. As I so often say by referring to one of my favorite period dictionary quotes, the close air support aircraft is an, open quote, controversial aircraft, end quote, in Germany pre-1943. The Luftwaffe is not convinced of its utility, and we can see this clearly in its doctrine. This will sound familiar to you if you have listened to my Luftwaffe Doctrine and German Bomber Doctrine episode. The Luftwaffe makes a distinction between unmittelbare Luftunterstützung and mittelbare Luftunterstützung. The first one translates to close, I actually don't like the word close air support in this sense, more like direct support, and the other one would be indirect support. The Germans, all the bombers, and yes also the Stukas, focused their main attention on indirect support, so attacking targets like headquarters, airfields, assembly areas, stockpiles, columns, infrastructure, and so on. This was done to attrite and paralyze enemy forces as the army launches an armored thrust. Check out my Sedan episode for a good example. In this early period, when you see a Ju-87 Stuka, for example, attack a position right in front of the army, which it did do at times, understand that conceptually, tactically, and operationally, this is not close air support, even though in practice the difference is potentially superfluous. Actually, no, that is nonsense. The difference is not superfluous, unless you talk only about the explosion at the end. Because the way the Stuka gets to the target pre-1943 and post-1943 is completely different. More on that later. So, what was close air support, or direct support here? Let's go with direct support, to the Germans pre-1943. It was not kinetic, it was reconnaissance and air defense. This is important. It shows how the Germans wanted to fight. Aircraft to break the back of the adversary with indirect support, while the army can advance rapidly with mobile forces covered from air attacks by fighters and flak, and always with up-to-date information about defensive positions due to aerial reconnaissance. As always, In the practical application of air power, we will find exceptions. For example, the 8th Fliegerkorps continuously starts to blur the lines starting in Poland. But even then, much of its support initially is not close air support or direct support, but rather more closely joined to the Army's decisive thrust, so that the aircraft always support the specific panzer divisions and motorized infantry regiments that form the tip of the spear and clear the area in front of them and weaken any sort of reinforcements that are supposed to come in, rather than just dropping the bombs right in front of the German infantry. This is actually an important point that the Luftwaffe keeps making. Just because the Luftwaffe is not operating in visual distance of the army doesn't mean they aren't providing air support. The army just doesn't see it. Actually, not just the Luftwaffe makes that argument, but like everyone during World War II and even later on, except maybe the Soviets. Now, to preempt a common counter to this all, you could of course make an argument that the Germans did have a close air support aircraft and unit at the start of the war, the Henschel 123 and Zweite Gruppe Schlacht Lehrgeschwader 2. As I mentioned in my episode on that aircraft, this is a straw man argument. Yes, this unit existed, but what is its actual significance at the time? This unit has 40 operational Henschel 123s in 1939. Actually, it was 36, but let's go with 40, which drops to about a dozen in 1940, augmented by like 20 early Bf-109E fighter bombers. This is at best, 1% of the total Luftwaffe force. 1%. And like I mentioned in that Henschel 123 episode, we do not have a lot of data on what the 123 did in detail. And many of the targets you find in books actually are cited as bridges and aerodromes and that sort of stuff, which is again more closely tied to indirect support rather than direct or frontline close air support. Now interestingly, of course, a lot of this changes post-1943, mainly due to the Eastern Front, but as far as I know, Germany actually never updates its official doctrine. But never mind that, that's another topic for another episode. But having gone through the conceptual stuff, let's go with the operational and tactical differences. I will talk about 3 operational differences that emerge across the war between Schlachtgeschwader and Kampfgeschwader. These were force architecture, basing and tasking. One of the biggest differences between the Luftwaffe Air Support and bomber units was probably how they were concentrated within the force level, specifically as part of Fliegerkorps. The Luftwaffe would bundle specific aircraft formations depending on what they would require for given operations. And what we can see in that pre-1943 period is that the Fliegerkorps generally had a bomber unit focus. The majority of these formations would have around half of their units composed out of Bombergruppen, which automatically shifts operations away from the front lines and towards the rear areas. Now there could be some exceptions early on, like again the 8th Fliegerkorps, which centralized more Stuka aircraft. But it did so because Ju-87 dive bombers were easier to base and task close to the front lines than bombers, rather than just thinking about close air support. I'll get into that soon. What we see post-1943 is that the so-called Nahkampfkorps emerges. It's like a close combat corps. Generally, they can still be called Fliegerkorps, but the more important element to remember here is that the composition changes. There are more attacker-type aircraft here, fighter bombers, anti-tank and dive bomber units in this sort of corps, rather than bombers. Thus, the focus of this corps will shift more towards the front line rather than the rear areas. So by knowing what sort of corps is supporting the army in any sort of operational area, you can also know where the air support will likely be, what sort of missions will be flown, what sort of munitions may be dropped, and how and what sort of effect can be achieved. And this is massive, both for the army to know about its operations, what can it expect from the Luftwaffe, and of course also for the adversary, because if they know what units are on the other side for the Luftwaffe, they also know how to shape their force to counter this in the operational area of this respective Fliegerkorps. Then let's talk about basing and tasking. Another massive difference here. Bomber units require a heavy basing investment to have the appropriate facilities for air crews and maintenance crews, ammunition, fuel and spare parts stockpiles, administration, repair, and quite frankly, a proper runway and a lot of space to park the aircraft. You cannot base a Heinkel HE-111 or a Junkers Ju-88 anywhere. And yes, with these aircraft you are arguably more flexible than with an even larger aircraft like the B-17. But by and large, these units got the good and large airfields, typically at some distance from the front lines. This is because there are fewer of these sort of big airfields. Typically they only existed around bigger cities or areas with a large infrastructure. And of course, these bombers also needed to be there to keep the planes safe, out of range of the enemy, out of easy range of the enemy. But it also, of course, limits then the areas you might want to be able to use bombers and where you cannot use them en masse. For the Luftwaffe, this was a massive issue on the front lines, especially on the Eastern Front, where far fewer pre-built airbases existed than in Central Europe. In North Africa too, this limited how many bomber units could actually be fielded, as any airbase that was built up or expanded would still be more limited than in Europe. And it also shows how important it is to have airbase construction companies. But that is a story for another time, and maybe something I should tackle with Justin Pike regarding the Pacific. Anyway, with a, let's say, direct support unit, close air support unit, right? They're flying something like a Focke-Wulf 190, a Ju-87 or a Henshu 129, you didn't need that sort of a big base, and more modest facilities were good enough. You could also disperse these units a bit more. A single grouper could be dispersed around 2 or 3 smaller fields with a Staffel on each. And then you fly to a dedicated rendezvous point to join up into a larger formation, and off you go. And of course, this basing issue also contributes to the massive differences in tasking. In a nutshell, mission tasking is all about figuring out where you need to send aircraft to strike ground targets. What aircraft you have to make this possible, and then you go off to gather local reconnaissance data, like pictures from the target area, so you can tell your pilots where to attack and what to attack. You also need to know what friendly troops there are, what the army is doing, and what defenses you might encounter. Well, of course, giving out orders to the individual units, then you have to get those aircraft ready to be fueled and armed up, and you need to get brief the pilots. And only then does the strike actually go off to do its thing. For a bomber unit, this takes a lot of time. Typically, these practical aspects of mission planning start about 48 hours in advance, allocating munitions and aircraft, plotting out routes, arming the bombers and fueling them, which in itself takes hours. Meanwhile, you also got to coordinate with either units like fighter escorts who may have more than one job at a time. And then when flying off, climbing, assembling into formation and rendezvousing with escorts and flying the distance from the target, from the airbase to the target, usually along the route that is the safest, not the fastest. Well, this all means that typically a bomber and its crew will only fly one mission a day. And for the Luftwaffe, these missions can be somewhere between 4 to 10 hours at a time, but that ignores, of course, all the other hours that are spent getting the bombers ready for this one mission. And by the way, this is still the case nowadays with Air Forces. Some of these tasking and mission planning can take quite a long time. And I've seen statistics from the Vietnam War, for example, that the B-52s, their mission planning took 72 hours. This is just the business of air power. For planes like fighter bombers and Ju-87 Stukas, this is different. I mean, it's not different. They go through the same motions, but it's less complex and more, can we say, time effective? Typically, these aircraft, they are based closer to the front lines and they are faster to rearm and refuel. And part of the mission planning is still the same with, getting information on the targets, troop positions and so on. But because of the tighter coordination with reconnaissance data, the army, and because these aircraft are faster and less complex to get to the target, they can typically fly more sorties. Something like 3 to 5 a day wasn't rare for the Luftwaffe when the fighting really got fierce. What is more, however, is that this tempo seems to accelerate as the Germans start forming Schlachtgeschwader, which is likely due to the advantages of having tactical attack guidance, which I will address soon. And as I go into the tactical level, let me talk about 3 things here again: altitude, bomb loads, and army air communication. Amongst the many things that make close air support work or not work at a time is altitude. This is what the Germans have already said in 1937. that the Ju-87 dive bomber cannot give close air support because you can't see what tropes you are bombing when diving in from 4,000 meters. But as a fighter bomber pilot in a, say, Focke-Wulf 190 going at 450 kph at 100 to 200 meters of altitude, not only did this pilot receive more training in target recognition of tanks and so on, but they also gained practical experience in working with German infantry and tanks, and they fly low enough to spot the visual differences. And at that altitude, you are pretty accurate actually when it comes to bomb drops, especially compared to bombers. And that is also necessary given the limited bomb load. Now the Germans actually try to do this sort of low-level bombing with bombers during the Poland campaign, and basically every single unit report I have seen says the same thing. A bomber is too unwieldy to hit most targets. What a fighter bomber can do is fly over a gun position, let's say an AT gun, right? And it keeps its eyes on the area and the target, makes a quick memorization of AT gun 200 meters south of the hut near the trees, and then you whip the plane around and you line up for the attack. It can even do that in a formation, a 2 or 4 ship. But good luck doing that in a bomber, where you need to be slow and deliberate in your maneuvers as you fly yourself and have bombers in your formation, let's say 2 or more bombers, and you probably have to extend a few kilometers away from the target until you turn around and then go ahead. If you're at low altitude at this point, you're going to try your best as the bombardier frantically tries to spot the target with only a few seconds as a margin of error, and then the bomber and the formation, it just cannot maneuver for last minute changes. Actually last second changes. So what do? Well, they compensate by dropping a lot of bombs. For what, an AT gun, 2 AT guns? Let's assume you're hit. It's maybe not the best trade, given that these bombers could have been doing something else, like hitting a railroad station or a stockpile that keeps bringing in reinforcements and supplies. And this then also goes into the second tactical difference, armament and bomb loads. Now this is always a trade-off. Fighter bombers are fast and maneuverable and they're able to defend themselves, but they carry fewer bombs, whereas bombers are slow and sluggish and they need protection and are easy to shoot at by light anti-aircraft guns, but they do have a lot of bombs. Depending on the target, one may be better than the other. A fighter bomber is great against a train, but bad against a train station because it just doesn't have the bomb load to really destroy it, even as part of a formation. However, a bomber, provided it is at higher altitude, so it doesn't have all the light anti-aircraft guns that are usually centered around train stations shooting at it. But when it comes in, it is good against a train station because it has that bomb saturation effect as a formation. But it's going to be less good against a train. And also, a fighter bomber, or in the case of a Ju-87, a smaller single-engine machines in essence, can typically carry more specialized weapons like gun pods and still have that maneuverability that is needed to put them on target. That is much harder to do in a bomber, which is why when we see them equipped with larger caliber guns across the war, across all the nations, they're typically hunting ships, because those are big targets and they're hard to miss. And then Army-air communication. Basically, the bomber units didn't really have direct Army-air radio communication. What they had is they had knowledge of the overall objectives of the army, and the Luftwaffe then told the individual bomber units where to strike, and that was generally done in a way that would best support the army's goals, or assumed best support for these goals. For close air support, this changes, but it only really changes post-1943 as well, when the Schlachtgeschwader start growing in number. Pre-1943, the Stukas attack a frontline target as part of a pre-planned strike, which is like deliberate targeting, right? Which the army was told about in advance or requested. But there is little communication between the aircraft dropping the bombs and the ground units in the area. The pilot gets reconnaissance pictures, gets briefed on local defenses and ground units, gets told by their mission commander how they will fly to the target and at what time they are meant to arrive, say 1400 hours, then drop bombs by 1405, and then the infantry attacks at 1407 hours. But the Luftwaffe doesn't care about that last part. The success of this is down to planning and timing, not communication.
Also, if the target changes location on the front lines, you usually can adapt once the planes are en route. Yes, of course, radios existed, but typically, once planes took off, that was it. This is why, as a rule, pre-1943, the Luftwaffe conducts its support only against static frontline targets as opening strikes for the army. But is that really different to sending a bomber? Like, nothing changes except that you trade accuracy for tonnage. And that, of course, fundamentally you want to use bombers against large targets, not fortifications and such. This is why the Germans initially introduced so-called bombing lines, a few kilometers away from the front lines, and everything on the German side was off-limit to the Luftwaffe based on certain times and certain checkpoints, because it was just too easy for the Luftwaffe to bomb the German army. And even when they introduced those bombing lines, it still happened. Now, to prevent this, you can say, well, shouldn't there be this joint terminal attack controller, like a JTAC, right? Nowadays, we call them JTACs. Well, there is no joint attack controller pre-1942, 1943. Okay, yeah, sure. The Germans had liaison officers and some radio comms people for army air communication, but by and large, that was only for close reconnaissance units. The sources are very clear on this. Post-1943, that's where we start seeing changes, because we have these so-called Fliegerleitoffiziere. Yeah, that's an old-fashioned joint terminal attack controller, a JTAC, as we know them today. At that point, the Leitoffizier can actually talk to the pilots and guide them to the target, and also update them if the location or if the requirements for the attack changes. This really fundamentally shifts the way that the Luftwaffe can apply tactical air power at the front lines. And talking about that, I'll probably have to make a separate video on this. So there you have it. Those are some of the main differences. Thank you for the question, Stahlfaust.
Join me next time on The Luftwaffe at War as we dive deeper into the Luftwaffe's operations, aircraft and thinking during World War II. The show is written and produced by me, Christoph Bergs, and if you want to get a hold of future episodes early, vote on topics and get priority access to Q&As, become a supporter of The Luftwaffe at War at patreon.com/milAvHistory or via YouTube memberships on Military Aviation History. A big thank you goes to all the supporters for making this possible. As always, thank you for joining me today and have a great day and see you in the sky.